Hello everybody and welcome back to the Kurvendil YouTube channel. Recently I've been getting more and more into sculpture, and today I want to show you how I made my third ever larger cast metal sculpture, which is also the first which I fully made myself right here at my home. I started sculpting by making the 8 arms. The material I'm using here is monster clay in the hard variety. To make sure they're all equal, I weighed out the same amount of clay for each arm. Between the arms I added a bit of skin and then moved on to making the suction cups. And boy, were there a lot of those. I textured the skin with this ball tool, and once the underside was completely finished, I turned the whole thing over to sculpt the head. Putting the clay in the microwave makes it soft, so it's easy to build up material quickly. Afterwards, I shaved all of the surfaces back down to create my final shape. The entire surface was then again textured with the ball tool. As you can see, I sculpted the model in a neutral position, which is the equivalent of a T-pose for an octopus, I guess. The reason for that will become apparent later, but for now it's time to move on to making the mold. For the first layer I used very liquid silicone to capture the detail around the suction cups with as few bubbles as possible. In a later step I built up some layers using thickened silicone. During that process my hands were constantly gunked up with sticky silicone, which is why I didn't film any of that. Here you can see I also added some extra material at the seam where I would later cut the mold apart. In preparation for making the plaster support mold, I parted off the lower half along the seam using some water-based clay. These notches ensure a nice locking fit between the plaster mold halves later. Now I covered up the whole silicone mold in plaster and canvas strips. And this is what it looked like once I completed both halves of the mold. Now followed the somewhat nerve-wracking task of cutting apart the silicone mold along the parting line. Notice how I'm constantly angling the knife so that I get an uneven, jagged cut that helps the two halves fit together more nicely later. During the extraction the original model broke, but it has served its purpose now, so it's fine. Next up, the wax model. I first made sure all the surfaces got a nice covering of bubble-free wax. Then I cleaned up the parting line and tightly joined the two halves together. Through a little gate I cut open at the head, I now poured in more wax, let it build up a bit, and poured out the excess. Now I could demold the wax model and start making the actual sculpture. I first cut out a triangle in the underside of the head to be able to position the sculpture over the corner of this marble block which I had made for this piece. My initial idea was to soften the wax a bit in lukewarm water before manipulating it, so I moved over to the bathtub to continue working. Turns out this didn't work well at all, but oh well. Once I was done bending the arms all around the block, they were pretty cracked and messed up in countless places, so there was a lot of cleanup modeling to be done here. To make sure I could remove the wax model again, the stone block was wrapped in plastic wrap and tape, and I also oiled it up a bit. I decided to cast the sculpture upside down with an influx channel at each arm and one towards the head. The smaller channels are there to let the air escape during casting. Embedding the model in my plaster mix was a two-person job, so my mom helped me out here. What I'm using here is plaster mixed with sand and crushed bricks. Once that block hardened up, I moved it over to my pottery furnace and baked it for around 24 hours. This melts out a lot of the wax and evaporates the rest, together with all the moisture in the plaster. In preparation for casting, we embedded the block in some gravel to give it some outside support. The weight of the molten metal should not be underestimated and can totally break apart a mold like this. The newspaper covering is just there to prevent gravel from entering into the mold. camera setup here is truly crap, but there we are, casting the sculpture. After a few hours of cooling, the mold was freed, and I began tearing it apart to reveal the sculpture. The channel system was cut off, and all the places where a channel connected were ground flat. Little bubbles of metal on the surface were chiseled off. Wherever I ground off the texture because there was a defect there or a channel attached previously, I used this punch to recreate the dimples right in the metal. There were a few small holes as well, which I TIG welded shut, ground flat, and then re-textured. As should have been expected, the sculpture warped and shrunk while casting, so I had to readjust the fit around the marble block. To do that without ruining it, I made a wooden box with the same dimensions. And here's a test fit with the stone block. To attach the sculpture, I welded a rod with some notches to the sculpture's underside. Then I drilled a hole into the block to glue the rod in afterwards. In preparation for the final finish, I gave it another round of sandblasting. I washed off any residue with clear water and then started applying a patina. After gently rubbing around on the surface to remove some of the patina in exposed places, the contours came through really nicely. For a little extra effect, I polished up the eyes a bit to make them pop. After the sculpture had plenty of time to dry, I warmed it up slightly with a heat gun to more easily apply my wax finish. On the bottom of the sculpture I sketched out my signature and engraved it into the stone. To make it stand out, I added some gold paint to the recess. Lastly, I mixed up some glue and put the sculpture into its final place. And there you have it. That's how I made my best and most complex sculpture so far. I still have more octopus sculptures in mind that I want to do in the future, and they'll be based on the same original mold but then taken into completely different directions. If you're interested in seeing that and whatever else I make, be sure to check out my socials. I often post smaller projects there which might never become a YouTube video. Cheers, and I'll see you in the next one.